Welcome one and all to the Stock Up Podcast, your one-stop shop for stocking up on the information you need to qualify for the Pro Tour. My name is Alex. I'm joined as always by my co-host, Jacob Negro. Jacob, how was your weekend? I heard you did some traveling to play some Magic.
It was good, yeah. I went to Phoenix to play in Laughing Dragons. They had two RCQs in the weekend. One was a 2-day standard RCQ with $20,000 in prize pool, and the other was a 1-day modern 5K RCQ. I did not cash either event, but it was still a fun trip. I stayed with some friends and drove there, so it wasn't really that costly or anything. So just kind of fun. Hung out with Jonathan, who's one of our Patreons and regular listeners, so that was fun.
Well, that's good to hear. When you messaged me, I think the only message you sent me on the weekend was your losing record.
Yeah.
So I was like, damn, that sucks. Well,
yeah, I mean, I went 3-3 in standard. It's just a cut the day 2 type of thing.
Right. Well, yeah.
So
that you lost,
yeah.
Didn't even make day 2. That's always the worst. That's always the risk of going to Magic tournaments, right? Is anyone can, no matter how good you are, you could always just get mana screwed or mulligan or not have a good deck choice, and you just lose right away. So.
On that note, I don't want to do a deep dive or anything about Is It Cauldron, but that's what I played, and I just have some real quick, like, throw at you things that I would change if I were playing this weekend, like the Spotlight Series in Orlando.
Okay, great.
I would play 23 lands. Most lists play 22. I just think I would definitely add a land. You have a lot of this looting and rummaging. I think, like 3 Thundering Falls, 2 Soulstone, 2 Starting Town, 4 of the other lands. That makes sense to me. Something like that.
How many of the looting 3-drops did you have between the 2/2 flyer and the Thunder? Yeah, all that. 5
total main deck, 3 Steam Core and 2 Tursa, and a 4th Steam Core in the sideboard. This was basically copying what JMM did. What I would suggest moving forward, I think Steam Core Scholar is just better than Tursa after playing with it. I would start with 4 in my main deck. I think you could play 1 Tursa to fit that in, or if you want to fit in all 6 or things like that, that's totally fine too. Honestly, what it comes down to is that looting is better than rummaging. There are multiple spots in the tournament where I played a Steam Core Scholar and Vivi was one of my top 2 cards, and I got to discard Vivi and basically win the game because of that. And that's something Tursa can't do. Tursa, not only incentivizes you to hold land, you want to have like 1 or 2 cards in your hand, but also sometimes you can't afford to do that, and you're in spots where you have 0 or 1 cards in your hand. Tursa's less powerful. In mirrors, you really don't want to discard Vivi unless you're confident you're the one getting under Cauldron. So rummaging, generally, Tursa is up to 2, so it's not like you're ever forced to discarding Vivi with her, but it's just like you want to be able to discard 2 cards and draw 2. But if you only have 2 cards in hand and one of them's Vivi, you're like not going to do that. Whereas Steam Core Scholar gives you a lot more flexibility. Also, sometimes it's 2 for 1. So
yeah, that all makes sense, especially since the body size isn't super relevant in games you like have prof and things like that.
Yeah, and honestly, sometimes the ground gets a little gummed up's not the right word, but manageable in the mirrors, and a big flying vigilance creature can really come out on top compared to Tursa being good with profs. Last thing, I would not play Torch to Witness again. That was a 1 of in the sideboard. I'd probably just play like a Broadside Barrage. I would play 3 or 4 cards in that category that can, specifically I'm looking to kill Cosmo Grand Zenith. I lost the Pixie in the event, and anytime I've lost a Pixie on ladder, and also in that event, it's the same story. My opponent ends up with a Cosmo Grand Zenith in play that I can't kill. And it literally doesn't feel like the rest of their deck and their value things matter, at least not in that matchup. It's literally just they have a threat that snowballs the game incredibly hard, and if you don't have an answer to it, you're kind of just toast.
Yeah, that all makes sense. How many, I guess I saw your list, but I've forgotten. How many Riddlers did you end up playing?
I only played 1. I played it main deck. I probably wouldn't do that either. I'd probably play 1 or 2 in the sideboard, but on the topic of cutting a card for a land, that would probably be my top choice from the list I posted in Patreon. If you want like some quick changes, Nova Hellkite, don't play it. Cut the Riddler, find space for it in the sideboard, add a Thundering Falls, cut a Tursa for a Steam Core Scholar. That's another sideboard slot potentially up for you. Cut the Torch, play Broadside Barrage, maybe fit in an Obliterating Bolt. Honestly, you could fit in another of the Twin Maw Stormbrood. It's not perfect, but one nice part about that I didn't touch last week because it didn't come to mind is that Twin Maw Stormbrood, being a creature with flying, is a discard to both Winter Night Stories and Steam Core Scholar. So that's pretty nice for getting some card advantage too, just to fill your deck with that as some of your interactive slots.
Totally. Well, that all makes sense. The reason I asked about the Riddler is it's one of the cards that seems pretty good against blue-white control, and I saw people playing up to as many as 3, and that seemed like a lot. That was probably after sideboard. But
yeah, I could see that being a good sideboard card for blue-white. To be honest, I wasn't that unimpressed with it post-board in my mirrors. I just think game 1 of the mirrors are not as grindy. There's a little less interaction. Usually one person just kind of snowballs harder than the other. So I just think you can have post-board plans where you go heavy on interaction and board in 1 or 2 Riddlers in the mirror, and I think that's kind of cohesive and can work out. But game 1, I'd kind of just stay full on plan, and I really think the deck could benefit from an extra land.
That totally makes sense. Boy, a lot of topics we're already touching on for our main show.
Yeah.
Before we get into that, I wanted to mention that I played a little bit of Magic this weekend. I picked up an extra shift at work, so I didn't have a ton of time. But there was an Arena Direct for Play Boosters of Edge of Eternity sealed.
Yep.
And I did 5 total runs of that and won nothing. I sort of had the experience you did, I guess, in the Arena Open, where I got the bad part of this format, where you play against a lot of the colorless regular rares. Like, it seems like sometimes every opponent I lost to had either Anti-Casual Vestige or the Sliver thing. And I didn't have those myself, so that can be kind of rough.
This format seems extreme. The sealed format seems extremely high variance in the top quality of pools you can get.
Yeah, for sure.
The lack of fixing plays into that a little bit too, because there's some strong cards in each of the colors, but sometimes it just doesn't come together, and sometimes you have no option to play 3 colors, just things like that.
Right. Yeah. So I didn't feel like I could have played more, and I just decided I wouldn't, because it wasn't that fun. And then I realized that there was a standard best of 1.
Yeah.
For the same. I don't know if they've ever done that before.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Maybe it's something they were trying.
Seems like, I mean, this is already like the 3rd Arena Direct in 6 weeks or something crazy like that. I feel like maybe not that much.
I think they make them a ton of money.
Yeah, they must have
they're
realized
okay with running them a lot.
That they're not like dialing back on the number of participants if they run them too frequently. They must have figured that out. I mean, that makes everybody happy if there's events people want to play, and Wizards makes money off the events.
Yeah.
Seems like a win-win.
There's a streamer, so I hardly watch Twitch, but I just happen to follow a small streamer once called Lord Soren. You guys should check him out on Twitch. I liked him, and he plays them all the time. And I would categorize him as a more casual player. He's pretty good, but I don't think he focuses on even really winning them. He just likes to play in them. You know, I mean, obviously he's focusing on winning, but it's not the same mindset of like, I'm going to grind until I'm profitable.
Yeah.
He just plays them on stream for fun. And I bet there's a lot of people who just sort of play them.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of similar to a mentality people have with gambling sometimes too, especially with sealed, right? Where it's just like,
yeah,
anybody could open a good pool and win 7 games.
So I did do 3 of the standard best of 1 runs. I just changed my blue-white control deck around. Didn't think about it too much. I actually did it Sunday night when I got home from work, so it was after midnight. And I played 3 runs, and I didn't win anything in 1. I won 1 box in 1 and 2 boxes in the other.
Nice.
And I played against a lot of Izzet Cauldron, a lot of blue-white control, and then I also played against a lot of like tier 3 decks that I hadn't seen in a long time. Things like black-green mid-range, or I played against like Raise the Past decks, with like life gain and stuff. And I thought it was interesting. I guess when if you play the sealed directs, everyone sort of has this same fair shot where they don't need to already have X amount of wild cards or whatever. They don't have to come with a deck because it's the same price.
That makes sense.
So that might have been the easier event, honestly, than the sealed.
Yeah, there's also no requirement to be mythic or anything like that either to join either of those events. Anybody can join. And
so someone who wins a lot in their lower rank might think their deck is fine and just join.
Yeah.
And then get smashed by Cauldron over and over. So that was interesting. Yeah, we might as well get on to our topic. We're going to be doing an episode about sideboarding, specifically sideboarding in Constructed. It's sort of a big topic, so we wanted to just tackle one part at a time. I think sideboarding in Limited could probably be its own episode as well.
I agree. Yep.
As a reminder, you guys can find us over on patreon.com/stockuppodcast. At the moment, we've got one tier. It's $1 a month. You get access to all of our content over there, so check it out. And thank you to all of our patrons that we have at the moment. Of course, you could also find us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to podcasts. All right, so without further ado, we should probably start with building a sideboard, since in order to sideboard, you have to build one first. So when you are building a sideboard, Jacob, for any particular deck, what are you thinking about?
Yeah, I almost have been thinking, like, an answer to this question, I can almost give it like a dictionary-sounding definition that, you know, you're just trying to maximize your win rate against your expected meta game with your entire 75. And your sideboard, more often than not, is going to be things that most of the time they're reactive cards, but not always. We'll get into that later. But they're just things that are trying to maximize win percentage across popular matchups. And also, you know, I guess a kind of shorthand thing to tell people when they're sideboarding is to cut the bad cards in the matchup, which sounds tongue-in-cheek, but to some extent, especially if you're playing with a lot of reactive cards, that could just be kind of basically what you're doing. You're just looking at cards that don't line up well in certain matchups and trying to maximize with your 15 slots a way to replace them across all the matchups you expect to play against. Sometimes in Modern, you might see cards that are a bit more versatile, I guess, because there's so many different decks in Modern that you're just looking for a bit more catch-all type sideboard cards. But yeah, you're just effectively trying to set yourself up best for success. And I guess I view building a sideboard as almost like an easy, a medium, and a hard way. And the easy way is, you know, net deck a deck. Lots of people do that. Then you don't really have to think about the actual part where you build your deck. But
Makes sideboarding harder sometimes when you do that.
It can make sideboarding harder. Depends on who you get your deck from. Over, you know, my 20 years of playing Magic, sometimes I have people I kind of trust that I grab their deck and I net deck it, and I find sideboarding to be easy because I think they build their decks in similar ways I would. But there's plenty of times where I sideboard with a deck I copied and it makes no sense. Or even with my own sideboards, you learn that along the way just playing matches sometimes.
Yeah, like if you just threw stuff in there and you're trying to figure it out as you go. I will say, in terms of, as far as we're keeping it like kind of definitional, sort of by definition, what also you're trying, one way to think of it is you're trying to add the least amount of cards, since you only have 15 cards in your sideboard. You're trying to add the least amount of cards that you can play to make the largest improvement in the most important matchups. So it doesn't matter if you could add 5 cards to totally dominate, you know, a tier 3 deck. What you're trying to do is focus in on the decks that are important. And, you know, sometimes you only need to add a couple of cards if your matchup's already good, and or you maybe need a lot more if it's an important matchup and the matchup's bad.
Yeah, and then sort of taking that and moving into what I was saying with like a medium way and a hard way of building a sideboard. You often will see, I guess people call it mapping, you know, they use a spreadsheet or something, and they'll take their 60 card deck and then they'll kind of go through all the matchups and kind of decide what cards they want to bring out, or maybe there's very specific cards they know they want to bring in that matchup, and they make it all line up to fit in 15 cards. And I find when you do this type of exercise with a deck, sometimes it's surprising and you actually end up feeling like you can fit everything in 13 or 14 cards, and then you can really think about maybe a really high impact card for a narrow matchup or things like that. And then I guess...
Does this only work if you have specific plans for a matchup?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly takes learning. You know, this is a hard thing to do with a deck you've just picked up. It takes some learning. And then I guess also to kind of get into the harder way is ultimately your sideboard is just like a continuation of your main deck. And another way you could approach this exercise is to write down what 60 cards you'd like to have presented in each popular matchup. And then see if you take each of those sets of 60 cards and then, you know, ignore their overlap, are you still within the confines of 75 cards? And then from there, you decide based on metagames or what maybe cards are a bit more versatile across more matchups, what cards you're main decking and what cards are your 15 sideboard cards.
Okay, that all makes sense. What happens when you are playing against something you don't expect. I mean, do you sort of get in trouble if you build your sideboard with a strict plan, especially if you spread would you say spreadsheet it? Yeah. If
Yeah.
you do something as crazy as like a spreadsheet, do you get in trouble if you run into something out of the ordinary?
It would have to be pretty out of the ordinary often. I guess it also depends on what type of deck you're playing. You know, if you're playing a very proactive deck, then a lot of your cards will play towards your main game plan. So how bad can they really be in any random matchup? At the worst case scenario, you could just resubmit your game one, and it's not like none of your cards don't do anything if you're playing that type of deck. But yeah, certainly you can get blindsided on certain things. You know, this weekend actually in the Modern event, I played Broodscale, and I played against the Grixis Reanimator deck, and I think I just showed up a bit short of sideboard cards for that matchup in general. And not even because I felt like... I mean, the cards on my main deck, like Walking Ballista or Writhing Chrysalis, are somewhat proactive, but they're also kind of bad, and that's sort of where I felt like I was falling short when Grixis Reanimator was actually probably a really popular matchup. If anything, that might have been a larger sign to have not played my deck the way it was built in general. You don't have to play it with Writhing Chrysalis, of course, just things like that. So
My other thought would be, how much weight do you put in having diverse cards in your sideboard rather than, say, like, maybe in terms of counter spells, right? If you map something and it looks like Disdainful Stroke's just really good in the format, and you play 3 Disdainful Strokes, and then you play against a deck that uses maybe counter or cavalry, you run into a deck that has Cavern of Souls for their expensive cards, and maybe they have a lot of expensive or cheaper non-creature spells, and you really can't use the Disdainful Strokes, but you could have used something like Negate. Do you put any weight into that for unexpected things you might run into, or do you...
Yeah, I definitely do, and I see in the notes here you wrote down a topic that's sort of related to that, which is diminishing returns. So trying to have your cards be different covers this situation you're talking about, but also just in general in Magic, almost all cards have diminishing returns. Just, you know, some cards work well in multiples from how they read, like Ocelot Pride or something like that. But when you have 2 of the same card in your hand, you are now lacking an option compared to if you had 2 different cards in your hands. So I guess generally I do sort of hedge towards splitting my sideboard cards into having slightly different functions, but maybe still effectively being the same thing. I mean, Negate and Disdainful Stroke is a great example, where a lot of the times they're going to counter the same spell, like an Ultima or something like that. But you are just sort of hedging for different situations by having one of each.
All right, so yeah, that's a good point. Another thing I had thought of when I had written diminishing returns is sort of just the amount of cards you want to sideboard for a certain matchup. Obviously, you know, the first couple of sideboard cards you put in for any given matchup are probably going to have higher impact than the others that you have. One good example of this I can think of is back in Modern a long time ago, I played in a GP where one of the most popular decks was Dredge because they just unbanned Golgari Grave Troll, and I was playing a Jeskai control deck, and my Jeskai control deck I learned would need something like, 10 cards different than my main deck to even compete in that matchup. And in a format like Modern, especially at the time when it was so diverse, I just decided that there was just way too many cards, and so I just decided not even to sideboard anything for that matchup. And that's sort of an extreme, but the diminishing returns comes in sort of any matchup like that, where you might just want to sideboard 1 or 2 cards that would have a high impact, but you don't want to change your deck too much because you can only play so many cards in your sideboard.
Yeah. I guess I'm not sure I agree. I think a lot of sideboard cards that do the same thing, not necessarily even the same name cards, but like playing a lot of Graveyard Hate, that would have diminishing returns, I agree. But if your plan, for example, in this Jeskai versus Dredge matchup was like I have my 4 or 5 Graveyard Hate cards, but then I also have like a Batter Skull to contest the boards, like if they're doing different things and kind of playing towards a full game plan in the matchup, then of course you'd be costing yourself a lot of your sideboard slots. So I'm not saying that's correct, but I'm not sure that would make. I'm not sure a plan that involves siding in 15 cards in a certain matchup is necessarily like lacking percentage points in that matchup. Like the 15th card could be adding an equal amount of win percentage as the 14th card. I think hypothetically it would just cost you a lot in all your other matchups.
Okay, that makes sense. I've definitely had 75s where I just end up sideboarding a lot of cards in a matchup, even though some of the cards are only small upgrades and not really there. Like maybe the cards are there for a different reason, but it also fits that it's a small upgrade for a certain matchup.
Yeah.
So you could end up sideboarding a lot of cards, even though, not everyone is as high as impact as a few.
Yeah, definitely. And it's all about what you're replacing, right? I mean, there definitely comes a point where I think people over sideboard and they're actually losing win percentage by boarding out maybe a proactive element of their deck in order to board in more sideboard cards that are kind of more of the same of what they're already doing. That I think definitely happens a lot. So when I use the phrase over sideboarding, I guess I kind of mean that I'm not saying like you're using too many of your sideboard cards for this matchup. I'm saying like, no, you're actually making your deck worse in this matchup by boarding in that quantity of cards, specifically with which certain ones they are.
Right. So you're diluting your deck's game plan, that sort of thing. In terms of still like building your sideboard, obviously there's different types of sideboard cards. I wrote them all down. I mean, you can tell me if I missed one, but I wrote archetype-specific hate. There's narrow but efficient interaction. There's threat/win conditions, and then of course you could sideboard lands. Maybe you could go over each of these briefly and tell us why you would want to sideboard one over the other, etc.
Yeah. So archetype-specific hate is probably one that we might come back on at the later end of this episode about traps people fall into, but these are cards, I guess what comes to mind for standard. There's like High Noon, Rest in Peace. For modern, there's also Rest in Peace. There's Stony Silence. A big new one is Clarion Conqueror, which actually I think moves away from the trap. And to explain that is that these are cards that oftentimes are just enchantments or some type of permanent that sit there and play. Not always. Sometimes they're attached to a body, and that's a big deal if they are. But they are generally trying to stop your opponent's ideally main game plan from functioning. Sometimes you find windows that they don't have to be your opponent's main game plan, but another sort of thing that comes around. Referencing your Jeskai control deck again from a while ago, there used to be a red-green Valakut deck that would have some amount of Tireless Trackers and some amount of Relic Progenesis, usually both in against you. And I knew you would board in one Stony Silence against them. And that's not really hating on their archetype because, they're a big mana deck, but more just using Stony Silence as a way to cover their sideboard cards. So they don't always have to be, perfectly lining up against the archetype. You want to be thinking about their applications. But I guess these are also cards that have huge diminishing returns typically because, you play against a deck that Stony Silence is amazing against. They're going to have two plans against that type of card, either to remove your Stony Silence, at which point, sure, having two of them could be pretty good. But I think nowadays, more often, their plan is to win in a way that doesn't involve activating artifacts. And at that point, drawing a second Stony Silence is playing right into that plan of theirs.
Gotcha. Yeah, so that's definitely a weakness of archetype-specific hate. One of the things we'll talk about later is an important thing to consider is that you're actually sideboarding against your opponent's Game 2 deck, not their Game 1 deck.
Yeah. So then moving on, narrow but efficient interaction. This, I think, oftentimes comes in the form of counter spells. We have Consigned Memory being one of the most played card in Modern, and this is right in that category. And oftentimes, I feel like these counter spells are pointed in the direction of like expensive cards, Consign especially, but Consign even comes in spots where it hits little cheaper things, but even hitting the Cascade trigger on a Shardless Agent against Living End is a pretty big exchange of mana. That one also sort of creeps into hate, like archetype specific hate to some extent, because the Replicate can be really annoying for Belcher or Living Ends to fight through. But I guess these are cards that oftentimes end up just being one-for-ones. So you're trying to pair them, I think, ideally with some form of aggression or some sort of the game is sort of leading up to a moment where your opponent does something that gets hit by this piece of interaction you boarded in, and hopefully you're already ahead when this happens, because that's how you make the exchange on mana much more favorable.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could run into trouble, right? If your deck's all these narrow interactive spells, and you board in a lot of 1-for-1s, and you take out cores of your deck, and then you can't actually take advantage of the fact that they're just trading a card for another card.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, not that I think Consign is bad against Eldrazi. It's going to counter any of their spells, but it's about like that addition and win percentage. I'm sure as long as you're cutting some cards that are pretty bad against them, and they're a pretty polarizing deck that is mostly playing for a top end late game, so that's probably pretty easy to identify. But the point is, like, it's also not like a home run against them. That's Consign specifically, but in standard we've got Spell Pierce, Negate, Disdainful Stroke. Those are in that category too. When you cast Disdainful Stroke against blue-white control as your Cauldron deck, is it the Ultima that you're going to untap and win the game against, or is it a card draw spell when you're both just sitting even in the game? Because if it's the latter, they're probably not that upset that their card draw spell got countered.
Threats, win conditions. Is there a reason to put extra threats in your sideboard?
Yeah, usually you see this from more reactive decks. And these might fall kind of in the category of a catch-all. Not that it's really not the right term, I guess, but just a threat you can board in a wide variety of matchups is usually what you'll see these at. There's also sometimes people sideboard threats because certain decks have a huge vulnerability to them. Geist of St. Traft used to be typical for this type of thing. That's just literal hexproof, and some decks that don't provide blockers would have a hard time against a hexproof creature. I guess blue-white control decks before rotation, you'd often see like Hullbreaker Horror. That's sort of in this category too. I think the other category that I often see these is lifelink creatures like Baneslayer Angels or Kalidas, stuff like that, which are sort of anti-aggro tools that might catch your opponent not having the right removal to line up against them, or boarding out the removal entirely because you were a control deck. But also you can play that sort of game with these big lifelink creatures against any deck if you suspect they didn't leave in removal for these types of cards.
Gotcha. Decks like, is it Cauldron? I mean, I would consider that a really proactive deck.
Yeah.
And they often have like cards like Ral in the sideboard and Quantum Riddler. Why do those decks have those sorts of cards?
Ral is probably in that category I was talking about of being hard to interact with, being a planeswalker in a deck full of creatures. Planeswalkers, I guess, generally in this role, not even in Is It Cauldron specifically, I think the concept behind sideboarding a planeswalker is that your opponent's deck is not very good at attacking them. Because I think there's plenty of they've kind of designed planeswalkers nowadays to be this way, where I just think they're exceptionally strong on empty boards and usually pretty weak if you're behind on board and you play them. So having them only in the matchups where you suspect the board will be empty when you cast them means they kind of become a premium card in that matchup.
Yeah, I guess usually planeswalkers that are good in main decks and see high numbers are ones that can protect themselves exceptionally well, and it's been a long time since they printed one like that, to be honest.
Yeah, Ral is probably
Elspeth kind of fits.
Yeah, Ral is up there too, and we see the Is It Prowess decks. It's not uncommon for them to main deck them because plus it's the 5 makes a chump blocker. If your opponent can't kill it, that deck can untap and play a lot of cantrips and grow its loyalty really heavily. So there's certainly some that make the cut main deck, but yeah, usually as sideboard cards, it's because you're expecting to play them on an empty or near empty battlefield.
I do see lands in sideboards sometimes. Why would you want to sideboard a land?
Yeah, so I guess the more basic version of this, I'll imagine if you saw lands in the sideboard of a standard deck, is because you expect to significantly raise your curve post-board. I know in the days of Ramen Up Red, people sideboarded Glorybringers and often sideboarded a land. And, it's because they're playing a deck that was ideally stopping their curve at around 4, and now they've changed their plan to stopping around 5. And ideally, these types of lands also maybe have some sort of mana sink tied into them. Creature lands are the types I often see in sideboards. And there's a different category of modern day lands where I guess Beseju is probably one of the common ones I'm thinking of that you'll see in the sideboard. That's because that's a Beseju thing, I'd say. It's just one of the best disenchants ever because it's this modal ability to be a land, and kind of regardless of how many lands are in your deck, sometimes you're going to be happy that you have a land instead of a disenchant in your hand. But
yeah, that's one of the more obvious ones, I would say. It's interesting when people have like a creature land in their sideboard. It's like, what is this here for? But I guess
yeah,
you
almost
you
certainly to raise
explained.
your curve.
Yeah, okay. So you raise your curve, and then if you're raising your curve, it might as well be a land that does something in case you flood, I guess is
Yeah.
the thought.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Let's see. In that same way, I guess when you're putting lands in your sideboard, you have to be you're obviously cognizant of the mana restrictions of your deck and what cards you're putting in your sideboard, and maybe would you sideboard a land if you were adding a bunch of like double pipped cards off your splash color or something like that?
That one has been a little rare to me. The double pip specifically, I have seen, I guess, the single pip where I've seen maybe take a mono white deck that has maybe some red sideboard cards, no red main deck cards. They're maybe playing some red sources in their main deck, but when they actually board into these red higher curve sideboard cards, I feel like Experimental Frenzy is what comes to mind here. There's like the white weenie deck that splashed Experimental Frenzy, which is a high cost red card, and they didn't play 0 red sources in their main deck, but they kind of fit in extra red sources in their sideboard when they wanted more lands anyways.
Okay.
So that's almost like transforming their deck entirely, but it also sort of plays into what I was talking about sculpting your 60 in specific post-board matchups. And lands really play into that. You just might want to be playing a higher curve style of deck in certain matchups, and that could definitely involve having more lands.
Right, yeah. And you might not be able to sideboard cards you would otherwise if your mana base was different. Like if you're only splashing red, you can't really put double red cards in your sideboard. Or maybe you can if in that particular matchup you expect the games to go really long or something, and it wouldn't fit normally in your main deck, or wouldn't be acceptable for your main deck. Let's see, we talked about pre-plans a little bit with the spreadsheet analogy. I have to imagine, though, your curve is something you're thinking about when you're building a sideboard.
Yeah, definitely. Drastically impacting your curve. I mean, you could sideboard a land or even multiple lands to fix that, but it's typically something you don't want to be doing. You don't want to be siding out a bunch of your 1 mana spells for 4 mana spells, but that's a thing that can happen, and it's okay. It's just you have to think about it from the matchup. So I guess sort of moving forward a little bit, when you're making these sideboard plans and when you're sideboarding, you really want to be assessing like a broader game plan. Are you trying to get under your opponent? If so, you probably don't want to be raising your curve. Are you trying to play a long game with them? Then maybe raising your curve is okay. And there minor changes in curve, I think, happen all the time in sideboarding. You shouldn't be focused on some one-for-one thing where you maintain an identical curve in your post-board games or anything like that. But you do want to keep it in mind when you're building your sideboard and when you're sideboarding.
Yeah, I can imagine playing an aggro deck where maybe my opponent had fire magics in their sideboard and I wanted to cut my 2-mana X1 creature. But if I cut, 4 2-mana creatures, maybe even though it's bad against fire magic, maybe you can't do that because if your sideboard, if the cards you'd be bringing in would all just be spells or expensive cards, maybe that wouldn't even be acceptable.
Yeah.
Of course, that might not be the best example because you might still want to do that because fire magic is so good against 1 toughness creatures. But yeah. So let's say you built your sideboard for your deck, and now you've gone to a tournament and you're playing a game, and then you win or you lose. What are the sort of things that you consider after a game of Magic when you go to sideboard?
Yeah. So there's 2 things. There's some cards in my deck might be really bad in the matchup, and I want to make sure I'm getting those out of my deck for anything that I believe would have a higher win percentage. And then there's probably some cards ideally that I specifically put in my sideboard for this matchup. So you're trying to fit both of those in. And then I think being on the play or draw oftentimes does change how I sideboard. Usually pretty minor. And there's some decks I've played where that's not true. It's not like I always sideboard differently on the play or draw, but I'd say nowadays it's very often that I do.
What sort of changes do you look to make depending on the play or draw?
Those sort of that category of narrow but efficient interaction gets a little bit better on the draw, just because like that can catch you back up from being a little bit behind if you trade up on mana. I think that a kind of asserting any sort of proactive game plan that you already had is going to be better on the play. The sizing of creatures can matter a little bit. I guess I'll take, for example, at PT Aether Drift, I played Gruul, and this was not something everybody did, but I would board out some or all of my Hired Claws in these mono red mirrors, which was sort of controversial, but I just think oftentimes with a creature like that, you can be in spots where you play it on the draw, and then your opponent plays a creature that attacks into it and is larger, so you can't block. Or rather, they had a creature at the ready that does that. And then if you attack with it, like, you're not realistically racing because Hired Claw was just like one of the worst cards in the deck. It was just kind of a filler 1-drop. And the filler 1-drop can, apply sufficient pressure when you're on the play, but I just think on the draw, it's like not supplying a reasonable game plan, so I would board them out for more removal, including more expensive removal spells like Scorching Shot, which even though I'm upping my curve a little bit, I just think that giving myself some ability to answer creatures for more mana even is just going to play out better than trying to race my opponent when I'm already starting the game on the back foot.
Okay, so I'm guessing like with the Hired Claw, one of the things you mean is that card in particular. If you're going first, you can probably attack with it and pup it once, and then maybe it can keep getting through. Whereas if you play it on one and they have a 2-drop already, you might not even be able to attack.
Yeah.
Or
there's two parts of it. You might not be able to attack, or maybe you can attack and pump it, but the creatures bounce or things like that. But yeah, more so just that like on the draw, like you're just not going to win this race of, even if your opponent played Hired Claw first, like. They play Hired Claw, you play Hired Claw. They attack, you can't block. They develop a 2-drop, or they just played a 2-drop and attacked. You take more damage. You attack with your Hired Claw. Like if you're probably not pumping it. Like it's just falling like really far behind on damage on the draw, I guess. And it's just a card that you play it because it in every matchup in game 1 can apply pressure and do kind of the general game plan of your deck. But when you have more specialized cards in your sideboard or different options, it's the type of thing you can look to be upgrading.
Okay. And what type of reactive cards specifically get better on the draw? Do you mean things like Mystical Dispute, Duress?
I guess, yeah. So actually, I think removal gets better on the draw because of kind of the situation I just mentioned, that you're probably not going to realistically just be winning a race. If you and your opponent just played all the same cards in some aggro mirror, whoever's on the play is going to win. So you need to kind of change that dynamic and break serve. And so I guess it sometimes sounds counterintuitive to board in more removal and maybe some clunky 2-for-1s, but that is often what I do because I think it's just playing towards the game going away where maybe your opponent's start isn't blistering fast, but now you're sort of ahead because that happened. Because naturally on the draw in a mirror match especially, you're not going to be favored to win that game. So you need something. Mm-hmm. You need to kind of play towards something going right, and that's oftentimes what I'll do in aggro mirrors is play towards my opponent maybe not having their strongest draw and capitalizing it by having more 2-for-1s and removal in my deck. Sorry, to get back to your main point. The other kind of interaction, discard spells and counter spells. Counterspells, certainly, those are a little bit more awkward on the draw because you need to kind of be in a position that you can afford to leave up mana for them. So oftentimes in lower to the ground mirrors, I guess the opposite might be true, where I might have these cards only on the play, like a Spell Pierce or something in a Cauldron mirror, because I just don't think I'll have the luxury of leaving up Spell Pierce when I'm on the draw.
Gotcha. And then discard. So I once... When did I learn this? I learned this, I think, from Brad Nelson. He wrote an article about this, I think, where when Thoughtseize was legal and standard, and he was playing all these black mid-range decks, and he explained that he thought Thoughtseize was a card that was better on the draw than it was on the play. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. I'm curious.
Why do you think that would be?
Is subconscious. Well, it's sort of just an actual amount of card quantity. So like when you're on the play, you have access to like one less card on each of your turns. And a discard spell like Duress or Thoughtseize is taking away like a larger percentage of the cards you've had access to that game. It's also more likely to break your curve, and I think breaking someone's curve with a discard spell, that is to say that you take a card from their hands and on the next turn they basically don't cast a spell. That's like the perfect situation that you took, like you get them to basically just go land go, which happens less and less nowadays. Cards are decks are mostly all cheap cards and highly replaceable. But that is like the perfect discard spell in my mind, is one that makes your opponent not have a play the next turn.
Or at least makes them play off curve or something.
Yeah.
They have to play something that costs 2 mana instead of 4.
Because naturally a discard spell, you're spending 1 mana to take a card from your opponent's hand and that they haven't spent mana on. So if you play a duress and your opponent just curves out and spends all their mana, you're down a mana effectively as far as affecting the game state goes. But if you take their 2-drop and it was their only 2-drop, now you're up a mana in that sense. And that's another way to really pull ahead on the draw.
You know, I've since used that to good effect where sometimes in my reactive decks I'll board in Duress specifically, which, because, you know, Duress is always in standard, against like aggressive decks that don't have that many non-creatures, and you don't want to board in a lot, but on the draw, you know, since you have this extra card, you can kind of afford to just throw one away to trade for, like, you know, some pump spell or burn spell that wasn't actually going to do much to you, but it might save you some amount of life, which could matter since you have that extra card.
That's a great example in a spot almost I've found myself in identical spots. I guess I'll also, let's say, let's put it like this too, where like on the draw, sometimes you're a little bit more desperate for things to go right. And I think I'm going to compare Spell Pierce and Duress here in standard against Is It Cauldron, let's say even. When you're on the draw and you think, I'm going to use Spell Pierce to try to counter their Cauldron or their Prophecydetic Memory when I'm on the draw on turn 1, your opponent has like the ability to play around that, and you haven't done anything yet. So they could play a creature spell, they could play nothing, and kind of feel okay about that into that card, especially if they can sculpt a game plan against Spell Pierce specifically to play around it later. Whereas like a turn 1 Duress, you know, it could miss, that would be a disaster, but like if they do have the Cauldron or Profs or Winter Night Stories in their hand or whatever, it's going to at least hit that and maybe give you a little bit, you know, turn 1 might have been a turn that you don't normally have any plays in that matchup, and now you've got to sort of force a play in an exchange with your first turn.
So sort of tying into this, I think you mentioned the word roll, or maybe I'm just thinking of it because I have it written down. But certainly when you sideboard, I assume you're thinking of what the rolls for the matchup are going to be for game 2. And I imagine, well, my question in tying it to the play draw, is it possible for the rolls of a matchup to change so dramatically just based on player draw, or is it that never really going to happen?
Yeah, no, I think it definitely can. I'm going to bring it back to the Gruul Mice Mirror example, or even, I'm sure Mono Red Mirror from the last format before bans is comparable, but it's just that, like, if you're both an aggro deck with the same goal, and your creatures are way better at attacking than they are blocking, which seems to happen a lot recently. When you're on the play, you're just naturally going to be advantaged at, you know, playing your haste creatures and getting your opponent's life total to 0 before they do. And so this is often debated, I guess, and people will approach it differently. But I kind of view it as when you're on the draw, you should be making subtle changes to allow yourself to be the more reactive deck, and because you're the more reactive deck, a more value card makes more sense, some sort of 2-for-1 or even a Planeswalker or things like that. But this is a thing that at each of these events I've played at, I've considered if maybe I'm just wrong, and maybe your best hope in the Mono Red Mirror is to play the most aggressive deck you can and just sort of, you know, this is a strategy that won't work above 50% of the time. It just won't, but that doesn't mean it's the worst of your option, or like that. It could still be the best of your options in a post-board game on the draw to just present the fastest deck you can and hope that you win the race.
Yeah, it's tough. It's definitely not a strict rule. I've had that exact thought where I've made changes based on player draw, and then sometimes I think, you know, like sometimes later in the game something will happen, and I just wish I had like if I board out 3 mana counter spells, let's say, because I'm like, well, I'm on the draw, that on turn 3 I'm not going to be able to counter the 3 drop I really want to counter. And that sounds like a rational thing, but then sometimes you'll be late into the game and they'll play a card and you'll really wish you had that 3-mana counter, and maybe you have the card you sideboarded instead and it doesn't do the thing.
Right.
So it's not completely obvious that that's what you should do, but I do agree that I have that inclination a lot, and it's certainly something you should at least think about. I mean, everything we say isn't going to be perfect, but these are all things that we do when we sideboard. It's sort of how we logic through things.
Yeah.
Let's see. Back to your Spell Pierce example. What if your plan in, like, the Izzet Cauldron Mirror is just to board in your Spell Pierces, and then you're playing against your opponent and he just plays around Spell Pierce a lot? What do you do, and do you change your deck in game 3 at all, or do you stick with your Spell Pierces?
Yeah, that's tough because, whether you're on the play or draw would have changed from there. But if there was some imaginary scenario where I was still on the play, like I boarded them in on the play, my opponent played them around a lot, and I was still on the play.
Maybe if you had one main deck or something. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's certainly tough to, decide that from moment to moment. You need to have cards that make sense to board in instead.
In general, do you ever do this? My opponent is doing something unusual, so I'm going to change my decision about how I sideboard?
Typically not with their game actions. If they show me certain cards, or, even in an open decklist tournament, sometimes my opponent is sideboarded in a way I didn't expect, and that would certainly change it. But their actual decisions in game, there's a lot of context driven behind that. Spell Pierce is a card that you sometimes get to play around and sometimes you don't. And just one game sample of how my opponent played would probably not sway me into changing some fundamental belief that I thought Spell Pierce was good in the matchup.
Okay. Just to test the logic, I'm going to try to think of a more extreme example than even Spell Pierce. What about the old card Settle the Wreckage? Where that was a card that whenever your opponent, or it was a 4-mana instant that you exiled all attacking creatures. That's what it did, right?
Yeah.
So it was pretty common because that was a commonly played card in the format. It was pretty common for people to play around it, and I'm assuming more people would be more reserved playing against a card like that than others. Would that change your thoughts about sideboarding that card in or out at all? Since it's so extreme, like if your opponent is just all out attacking or always leaving back half their creatures, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's pretty extreme. That might play into it. That also plays a little bit into hidden information, I guess. If they're playing around Settle the Wreckage and it's closed deck list and you haven't cast Settle the Wreckage, then yeah, maybe you want to board it out. And the reverse makes even more sense to me, that if they're just not playing against Settle the Wreckage or playing around Settle the Wreckage at all, and maybe it was a matchup you didn't expect it to be good, but your opponent is showing no respect for it, then yeah, I could imagine boarding it in.
Okay, so there is definitely a point.
Yeah.
It just has to be, you have to be sure that's what's going on, not just he played around a Spell Pierce this game, but that's because he was flooded.
Yeah.
And he had plenty of mana and the game was slower, so maybe I still keep in Spell Pierce. Okay. Do you sideboard different if your deck is proactive or reactive?
Yeah, so I wanted to touch on this because I think let's start with the reactive decks. A reactive deck sometimes has a really clear path, because if you're playing Fatal Push and your opponent does not have targets for Fatal Push, you're going to want to board those out. And this can be true across a wide variety of cards, removal, counter spells. Sometimes you play a negate in your Jeskai control deck and you play against a deck of all creatures. Just all these types of things. It doesn't have to be necessarily framed as reactive deck versus proactive deck. It could be reactive cards versus proactive cards. But boarding out reactive cards oftentimes is easy, and sort of step one of even sideboarding is this card's not going to work, so I don't want it in my deck. And sometimes, you have more broad cards that you board out, and it becomes a little bit different there. Or sometimes all of your interaction is actually good in that matchup, but you still want to figure out how to fit in more sideboard cards. So it's not just a blanket reactive proactive. But I think I bring all this up to say there are decks that exist in Magic that are pretty much 100% proactive, and I find people really struggle to sideboard with those decks. And it's where people will tell you don't overboard. They'll have some rule that says I can only sideboard this many cards in the matchup. And that takes some real sort of mastery of your deck to some extent to understand what you can go without. It sort of depends if it's a combo deck or things like that. I'm going to use Ruby Storm as an example, which is kind of in this category of like the whole deck's going to work in every matchup. You're playing spells and trying to cast a lethal grape shot. So what do you side out if you're trying to board in usually interaction or maybe sideboard Flage for Boros? And you still want to be thinking about this big game plan and sort of what roles your proactive cards are doing. So as Ruby Storm, cards I've sided out some amount of Pyretic Rituals, and I've also sided out some amount of the Bryn's Resolve type cards, but it's usually one or the other. So if I'm trying to play a slower, grindier game, I feel like I can not need Pyretic Ritual for the speed. I'll still have the Desperate Rituals, and I'm not boarding out all of these Pyretic Rituals either, so I'm still going to assemble some amount of rituals for my big combo turn, but I'm planning on doing it much later. Whereas if the matchup's purely about speed, I don't have time to play all these 2-for-1 cards, and I just need to probably, usually in that spot I'm boarding in some interaction, just sort of hoping I find it to maybe hit a heat permanent or things like that.
Right. So you're saying with proactive decks, you have to be especially careful when you're sideboarding to not dilute your deck too much, basically. The worst case scenario is in the matchup, you're the proactive deck and they're the reactive deck, and you boarded in like too many rest in pieces or something, and you can't even put a clock on your opponent.
Yeah, typically with these proactive decks, especially in Modern, the cards you're sideboarding are not even cards trying to hinder your opponent from winning. They're cards that answer your opponent's usually archetype-specific hate kind of category cards. Sometimes it can be other things, but your sideboard interactive cards are almost just trying to, help you still assemble your combo to some extent.
Right. I will say, in a way, this is still kind of true for even the most reactive decks, like control decks. When you're changing your answers around, basically, after sideboard, you're bringing in the cards you want, especially in matchups. Let's say the matchup's fast, it can be tempting to cut things like your card drawing spells. But if you cut too many of your card drawing spells, even if you're bringing in lots of cards that are good in the matchup, which are usually cheap interaction, you run the risk of interacting a lot and then not actually being able to get ahead of your opponent because you have more lands than them, and they might have one or two sticky threats, that sort of thing. So you have to be careful.
Some 2-for-1s of their own. And
exactly, yeah.
You're actually on even footing with them. I feel like that's something I've done a lot as a player that plays very proactive decks, is my opponent boards out card draw, I board in card draw. If you lay out both decks, I actually seem to be the deck that is both more aggressive and has better late game.
You have inevitability somehow. Yeah, that's the worst case scenario. You definitely want to avoid that. For that reason, I usually never touch card draw spells when I'm sideboarding control decks. That kind of sort of goes back to both understanding your role and understanding how your opponent is going to sideboard. Because you want to think about what the game 2 is going to be, and you don't want to sideboard against their game 1 deck. Of course, sometimes you don't know what they're going to sideboard. So
and then I guess
that's where experience comes in. Yeah,
a last sort of note about these sort of sideboarding difficulties and what you should be siding out. Sometimes, in kind of a purely proactive deck or close to purely proactive deck, one of your cards is just your worst card, not matchup specific. It just, you could take it to an extreme of your deck is all lightning bolts and shocks. You're going to side out the shocks, like it's just one of your cards was the card that you ended up adding last to your deck, or whoever built the deck. It's sort of just filling in the last few slots. It's the best in slot. I'm not saying it's a bad card. It's just worse than your other cards. And that's something that when you play your deck a lot, you'll probably identify that some of your cards might just sort of be this filler role. And
maybe it's like your 5th combo card that costs 1 more mana than the other 4.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
That sort of thing. Yeah. And you're like, well, I need to fit something. I'll just cut this, obviously. So.
Yeah. And I guess this sort of segues into our last segment about traps people fall into while sideboarding. But just because you have a card that you side out every game or almost every game does not mean you should cut that card from your deck. Those two things don't have to both be true. Especially if you're a deck full of proactive elements, like then you're suggesting that you're going to cut this card from your deck for reactive elements, which means you're going to be better in the matchups where that reactive card is good and worse in the matchups where it doesn't do anything. And that's the whole reason you played just some sort of, middling cards that happens to be the worst card in your deck.
I think I might be a little confused. Are you saying if you find that you sideboard this certain card out a lot for games 2 and 3, you should take it out of you might think you should take it out of your main deck, but that isn't true?
That's what I'm saying. Yes, it's not.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah,
all right.
Not always.
So I did understand. Yeah,
it could be something. It could be the case. It could be something you learn and realize, but
right. But it could also be the case that, well, no, this is just a good game 1 card, and when games get grindier, I don't want it, but that's fine because it was still good in all my game 1s.
Yeah, or I want reactive cards in my post board games, but I don't know which ones, so I play this proactive card in my main deck.
Gotcha. Makes sense. Traps, boy, yeah. Sideboarding, it's funny. It's one of those things that when you're playing against a less experienced player, even if they have a matchup advantage against you, sometimes they sideboard in a way where they totally delete that advantage.
Yeah, and one that kept coming to mind while we were talking, and I'm both guilty of this, and also I think the language and jargon I kind of use sometimes confuses people when I talk about sideboarding, and it's that I'll just use the word cut all the time, and some people associate cut with remove all copies of this card. And then they expect me to use the word trim if that's what I meant. It's only cut 1 or whatever. But anyways, You could identify that Llanowar Elves is bad against fire magic in sideboarding. But I think a trap people fall into is then they cut all 4 of their Llanowar Elves. And
gotcha.
You could set up a plan where that makes sense, but it's okay to say this card lines up poorly against this interaction in the matchup, and then say, I'm just going to side out 1 or 2 of them, not 4, you don't need to go all in. It's okay to play less copies of some of your cards, even if they sound like, I think people get too attached to a card being either good or bad, and they have to play 4 or 0, and that's just not true at all.
Right. Well, so one reason you even play less than 4 copies of card at all is because you only want to draw a certain amount, or maybe because you only need a certain amount. So with Llanowar Elves against fire magic, maybe you still want Llanowar Elves because it's one of the best cards in your deck, but if you board out 1 or maybe 2, then you're reducing the risk that you draw multiple Llanowar Elves and get 2 for 1 easily by fire magic. Of course, there's other traps as well. I can think of one, boarding in redundant hate cards. If you board in both Rest in Peace and Stony Silence, but you only really needed 1 to shut down, and then your opponent, and you draw both, and now you can't pressure them, and now they can potentially completely play around those sideboard cards by sculpting a hand to destroy them end of turn and then combo off or whatever it may be.
Yeah, I definitely agree with boarding in too many hate pieces. I guess there's a big card right now that I think is an exception to this trap, and that is Clarion Conqueror, which is the 3-mana 3/3 flying dragon that stops the activated abilities of artifacts, enchantments, and creatures. And I'm a big fan of this card because a 3/3 flying is just usually a card that will effectively work in combat in a game. So you could draw a bunch of these and they're pressuring your opponent and disrupting them. So that's definitely been one of the better sideboard cards in a while. Excuse my bird.
Hush up, Riddle. Riddle wants to contribute. Yeah, Clarion Conqueror is nice. I mean, so in this example, if you draw 3 Clarion Conquerors, well, your opponent will probably just die even quicker. They don't have the luxury of sitting around because you're not pressuring them and then bouncing your 3 hate cards or whatever. So
yeah,
that totally makes sense.
It's not as clear cut as just because it's a creature. It's specifically a 3/3 flying. You could draw a bunch of containment priests against a graveyard deck, and that your opponent could play a psychic frog, and they're not attacking or blocking the whole game. But Clarion Conqueror is really in a category of its own that just, I think, it's really impressed me in Modern.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's card specific, of course.
But Rest in Peace, Stony Silence, those are ones more in this category of, Modern's a great example right now where a lot of these graveyard decks play Psychic Frog. So if you just board in a million graveyard hate cards and all they do is graveyard hate, your opponent is just playing one of the best creatures ever printed that doesn't actually need its graveyard at all. I mean, it can't gain flying, I guess, but it's just can kind of steamroll you and give them extra cards, and they can still discard their bad cards to pressure you faster with it, just things like that.
Yeah, totally. What other sorts of traps can you think of? I can think of one if you can't, but
so when you like win a game one with a card that is bad in the matchup and then you leave it in.
Oh, I've
That's
done
still
that.
just like sort of living off these one game sample sizes to impact your
Right.
decisions too much.
Right.
And the opposite happens too. Sometimes, like, this sort of leads into your opponent playing around Spell Pierce we were talking about earlier, but it can be a little bit more, or a little bit more clear cut than that, where like you board in, I don't know, like a negate against a blue-white control deck and they play all creatures and you think your negate is bad, but like if it's open deck list specifically, you might just know that they drew, 4 of their 5 creatures or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you might get someone with a card you have, but maybe, it shouldn't actually be good in that matchup. So you might still want to recognize that and sideboard out. Like if your opponent's playing a deck where they're not really weak to a sweeper, and you blow them out with a sweeper because they just happen to draw like all their creatures and they didn't draw much of their instant speed things or something like that, you might still want to board out your sweepers.
Yeah, or sometimes, I'm thinking of a great example. Boros Energy sometimes main decks a Blood Moon, and that's a card that can steal a game really easily. Especially because you already stole a game with it, it's just going to be way less likely that your opponent...
Right. Like maybe your opponent's deck actually has a lot of basics, but they just happen to draw lots of fetch lands and they didn't play around it at the first time.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a really extreme example that I hope people don't do, but I imagine some have, is that you could be playing a Boros Energy Mirror where they're equally set up as you are to play around Blood Moon, but you just happen to play it like turn 3 on the play and steal the game with it, and they never have white mana.
Yeah. Okay, how about this? Are there any types of cards or categories of cards that you think people over sideboard or like put in their sideboard at all too much?
Well, I think this goes back into diminishing returns. I would say all the categories of sort of sideboard cards we talked about are guilty of this. I guess threats, win cons is one of the bigger ones, where I think sometimes people just have these weird plans that involve like 4 of some threat in their sideboard that they think is really good, but just ends up like not working out, or maybe it's only working because it's hidden information. But even if you're playing a closed decklist tournament and it's hidden information, like you play this weird off the wall card game 2 and then your opponent sort of respects it in game 3 and it doesn't work, and then it's just like not a very effective use of your sideboard slot.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was thinking of cards, well, a card you told me about in Modern, Orm's Chant. People love to sideboard a lot of that. I was thinking of extraction effects. Those tend to be overvalued, I would say.
Yeah, sideboards. I agree. Yeah, man, Orm's Chant is a very weird one because there are people that seemingly love that card, and I see people play 4 of all the time, and then plenty of people I talk to, and to be honest, people I sort of respect as deck builders more, would just never put that card in their 75. And it's just...
Yeah. I remember Surgical Extraction was kind of that way, where it was a really relatively popular sideboard card, especially against low-level players, for reasons that weren't like, Surgical Extraction to me is a card that's particularly good against something very specific, and you don't want to be boarding it out. You don't want to just have 3 in your sideboard that you bring in 1 or 2 in almost every matchup, which I think some people make the mistake of doing that.
Comically, Surgical Extraction actually is looking a bit more reasonable play in Modern than it has been in a long time, because there's a Grixis deck with Unearth and Persist. But that sort of answers your question that I like casting Surgical Extraction when my opponent is targeting a card in their graveyard and that's on the stack. Like
exactly.
That's when it's best, when you're doing this 0 mana sort of blowout. I don't like using it for the extraction effect. It's almost closer to just being, instant speed exile target card from a graveyard for 0 mana is what I'm actually really liking that card for.
Right, yeah.
But the extraction effect certainly has its moments, but I think with those extraction effects in general, I guess Surgical is more guilty of this. You have to think about, how is this card getting in my opponent's graveyard and it hasn't completely blown me out or literally won the game yet? Because sometimes people have this goal of like, I'm going to Surgical their Primeval Titans, and it's like, but your deck doesn't interact with their Primeval Titan.
Yeah.
So
also, maybe, or they have this silly plan of like, well, I'm going to Thoughtseize it and then Surgical it.
Yeah, well, I was going to say that
maybe.
The Thoughtseize push decks are maybe the ones that can get away with that a little bit more, but I still wouldn't advise it.
Yeah, it could still be. I mean, certainly you're not going to try to Doomblade a Primeval Titan and then Surgical it, right? So
yeah, and then like I guess both Orm's Chant and Surgical, and I'm sure we could find some other cards in this category. I'd almost categorize them as like being both archetype specific hate and also narrow but efficient interaction, but in the bad way. Like in the same way that starting count is a pain land and a fast land. It's not good to be in two of these categories at the same time. It needs like two things to go right for these cards to actually work out. Your opponent needs to be like playing a deck that this card works really well against, and they need to play their turn in a specific way that card lines up against it well.
Right. And then there's extraction effects like Stone Brain, which I think is legal in Standard, or at least was.
It rotated.
Okay. Yeah. And that, that was a honestly kind of terrible card, I think, in Standard. I don't know that there was any good situation for it. In theory, a card like that could beat certain decks, but mostly the way even control decks that have only one or two win conditions in Standard nowadays, usually they have something that will double as a win condition, and if you're just spending an entire turn time walking yourself, they might just completely take over the game.
Yeah, and also like threat light or combo decks are exactly the type of decks that usually have alternate win conditions or more threats in their sideboard. So post-board games are actually like the worst spots for a card like Stonebrain. Not that I'm advocating you go out there and main deck Stonebrain, but that's really just, I think, shows
the weakness.
Yeah, and it's kind of identifying this thing we were talking about of understanding what changes between game 1 and game 2. Because just because you identify like, oh, versus Ruby Storm, if they don't have any wishes in their deck, they have no ability to win the game. That's just not true in post-board games. Things like that.
Yeah, totally. Okay, well, was there anything else you wanted to cover?
No, I think those are the big ones. I do think sideboarding is, just a spot I feel like I've gained a big advantage of, or like over other players over the years. Even at higher levels, I've been surprised at the way people sideboard sometimes. And I also think it's been my downfall.
There's a lot of leveling going on.
Yeah.
Even at the high levels. Once you get to a really high level and your opponent's going to make good sideboarding decisions, you can do interesting things, like take advantage of that, and then they can do interesting things of noticing that maybe in a game 2 and then potentially changing something in game 3, which maybe actually makes me think of something specifically, which is I think if you're trying to do the most optimal thing, you don't necessarily want to physically let your opponent know how many cards you're sideboarding. Like, let's say you're boarding in 1, 2, or even 0 cards. You don't want to just set 1 or 2 cards to the side and then very clearly put 1 or 2 cards from your sideboard in. You want to conceal it in some way, whether that be I know some people shuffle their entire sideboard into their deck every game, or, they hold the 2 close together so it's not super obvious what you're doing.
Yeah, I used to be the shuffle whole sideboard card or sideboard in, and I've moved towards just like grab my entire 15 card sideboard and have it, it's literally touching like the front of my 60 card main deck, and maybe I'll shuffle them around a little bit. So there's, you could have a sense of what it is, but it's not going to be some perfect 1-to-1 match of how many cards I'm sideboarding. Also, that involves them kind of looking at you.
Right.
This is a different topic, but I do a lot of things nowadays where like I care about the clock a lot more, I feel like, than I used to.
Okay, that makes sense.
In these tournaments,
you don't want to go too overboard.
Yeah, I've been like cutting my opponent's deck rather than shuffling them in paper a lot more. But as a trade-off, if they pick up my deck and shuffle them, kind of a nice upside is I just get to look at them and look at their eyes while they're doing that. So I feel like that's actually more like a point of where I could get cheated, is my opponent looking at my deck while they're shuffling it. And I think people aren't like actually stacking their deck, and I'm still cutting it. So
yeah, I definitely lean towards, even in really competitive, I got to the point where I would either cut my opponent's deck or I would pick it up and shuffle it, but very briefly. And then I wanted to also say it's also optimal, let's say if you play a sideboard at game 2 and then you're going to game 3, even if you're not going to change anything, I do think it's optimal to make it look like you've changed at least one card.
Oh, I absolutely agree. This matters.
Like go to your sideboard and pull it towards it, or put in one card and then take that very certain card in, or something, even if it's really quick. It just means that your opponent can't expect the exact same configuration as they did.
I agree as well. The one exception is if you're very low on time going into game 3, but
yeah, I'd agree with that. Although if you're really low, maybe you need to go grab some creatures out of your sideboard and throw them in or something.
Yeah,
that can definitely come up with some.
It also it's kind of a weird thing where you and your opponent have to sort of read each other on that, because if you present your deck and then they just take their time sideboarding, you didn't accomplish anything by not sideboarding. So.
Yeah, that's true. Or if your opponent's just playing at a certain pace no matter what, that might make the decision. But it's kind of just there's no real right answer on that, and you just need some experience to kind of figure out what's the best thing to do in those situations, but that can be tough. Okay, well, that'll do it for today's episode, folks. I thought this was a good one. We'll definitely have to do an episode for limited sideboarding, I think.
Yeah, I think that one has...
Because it is a lot different. Yeah.
I mean, also because you didn't show up with your sideboard, so that's
right.
A difference.
Right, yeah, totally. Okay, so we'll see you all next time. Thanks for watching. So what do you think of Through the Omen Paths? Do you even know what that is?
I don't know what that is.
So this is what they announced it a couple days ago. This is what they're calling the sets that are going to be on Arena, but not in paper.
Okay.
Well, they're going to be mechanically the same, but the cards are going to be different. I guess they plan on... I think they essentially mean that this is going to happen again with not just Marvel. And so they're just calling these things Through the Omen Paths, just like they have Universe Beyond sets. They're going to have Through the Omen Path sets.
Okay.
Which is pretty interesting. I think the most interesting part about it that I want to ask you about is I think this essentially means that they know that more than just Marvel is going to be like this.
Well... I'll add
or at least
think there's going to be 6 Marvel sets, and I don't think it's going to change. So this could be only Marvel.
Okay, yeah.
It just could be their plan for all of their Marvel things. To add
so
to
I
that,
read
Marvel Snap is already on digital card game, so I assume that's what is kind of preventing them from having it as a digital card game.
Right. Let me find the article exactly. I'll tell you why I thought the way I did. Let me read it.
Yeah, I pulled it up.
So it says, we will not be creating Through the Omen Path sets mirroring every Universe Beyond set, only the ones that will not be coming to digital platforms. This lets our formats remain mechanically at parity with one another digitally without having to create patchwork solutions here or there. We are also currently only planning to create Through the Omen Paths releases for full sets that are legal in all formats. For the remainder of 2025, 2 Universes Beyond sets will be coming to MTG Arena and Magic Online, Magic the Gathering Final Fantasy, and Magic the Gathering Avatar. 1 2025 set, Magic the Gathering Marvel Spider-Man, as well as future Marvel sets, will not be coming to digital. Instead, we will release the Through the Omen Path set. Yeah, I don't know. My intuition reads that as this may happen in the future, but they might not know. You might be right. They may just be like, well, perhaps this will happen in the future, but for now it's just the Marvel sets.
Yeah, and to add to this, I don't think this is some mistake on Wizards' part, right? They just want money, and they probably knew the whole time that they made some paper Spider-Man set that it wasn't going to work online, or maybe they make the deal and but it's not like it came to a surprise to them. They either knew the whole time, or they said, we'll work on getting the digital rights to it, but we're not attached to it.
Yeah, they've certainly known for a while at least.
Yeah. I'm excited because I just think they're going to sound really funny. They're just going to be weird little spider obsessed freaks that.
Right. Well, I'm curious, right? It'll be interesting to see if they put as much effort into it as they do a normal set, in which case it might actually be pretty cool.
Yeah. I mean, it's so weird because these Spider-Man cards are spider heroes and villains, and they care about spiders, heroes, and villains.
Yeah.
So, and you can't change those. You can't change what those words are. You have Aunt May that cares when a spider enters, so you're just going to have some legendary human citizen,
right?
Because whenever a creature enters, you gain 1 life. It's a spider, put a counter on it. That's just some spider-loving rando.
Mm-hmm. And let's say they got some other IP, I don't know. They got a Disney IP or a Nintendo IP, then they weren't allowed to have that digitally.
Yeah. People love to I don't know. I feel like I hear so much that, oh, what's the most popular thing Magic could do? And the thing that always comes to mind is Pokemon. And it's like, well, they could never do Pokemon. And it's like, I don't know. People love money. There's probably a way that Game Freak and Wizards could get along.
Maybe Pokemon has the unique thing of being a Japanese company, and they're very like they've only ever done one collab ever, and it was with Mario. Which is, also
it's also
Japanese.
fair that like it costs. It's a really big long term like risk to let them put your card games on their card. So I get it, but I don't know. I could imagine a future where Magic is so successful because these Universes Beyond sets just keep knocking it out of the park, apparently, where they just take over everything that you've ever heard of.
Yeah. I mean, I know people are complaining a lot that these are always so expensive and this is just going to be the thing going forward. I do think there's a chance that after a year or two of these Universes Beyond sets, they lose a little bit of the allure and they've already burned through the lowest hanging fruit in terms of IPs. And
it's weird to me that they're more expensive.
Yeah, is it? I guess it's just they have an excuse.
Yeah.
So why not?
Yeah, I mean, Final Fantasy definitely like knocked it out of the park at least. I'm less offended that a set like Final Fantasy is more expensive than I'm offended that like a Masters set is more expensive, because a Masters set, not to be too critical of whoever's job it is at Wizards, but I feel like you could build some of these sets in like a couple weeks or whatever with all reprints sometimes, and maybe the draft format wouldn't be as good or whatever, but there's some that were crazy exceptions. I mean, I guess this is something everybody hated, was that 30th anniversary with the proxy cards.
Oh right,
they weren't real.
Yeah, that's because it touched the reserve list. Yeah,
I just also think that wasn't a draftable format. That was just a pure reprint alpha type of set. I'm pretty sure somebody could have got that in the card file in a day.
Yeah, well, that was an example of them
$1,000 and they're up money.
That was them an example of pushing the barriers, I would say.
Yeah.
Secret Lairs in general are already a huge profit because they only have to print 5 cards per packet as opposed to like a booster box, where they have to print tons of cards. Because it's not like it costs them more to print. I mean, it costs them a little more probably to print a foily card than a non-foily card, but other than that, it's the same to print a mythic as a common. So they were just pushing the boundaries because that would have been, because I think they sold it for $1,000 and it was like, hardly any cards. So the margins of that were insane. So if that would have been a huge success, then they could have kept making proxy cards basically for huge profits. So it's probably fortunate that didn't work out, that people were so upset about it. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, right, Wizards just a company and they're going to do what's best for the brand. And that's obviously why we have Universes Beyond in the first place. It would be funny if these Through the Omen Path sets, like maybe they spent a long time on them and they really work hard on them and they actually nail kind of the flavor within themselves. And it'd be funny if, like, for say the Spider-Man set, because I'm not very excited about Spider-Man, if I liked the Omen Path versions of the cards better than the Spider-Man cards.
Yeah, Spider-Man's a weird one to start this with, because like Final Fantasy has like your wizards and your kind of graveyard mechanic, and I felt like you have these sack themes with cards that made sense. I felt like you had all these kind of color themes in Final Fantasy, and the cards felt very different from each other. And every time I look at Spider-Man, I'm like, it's a spider, it's a spider, it's a spider, it's a spider.
It's a legendary creature. That's Spider-Man number 5 in the set. Every time I see this, I think the same thing. And then I see the Avatar cards, and I'm like, okay, this is like good. This fits. And then
exactly.
Like, can we just skip Spider-Man?
Going on, and Spider-Man is only one thing.
Can we just say Spider-Man's a commander set and just go straight to Avatar? I mean, they're already spoiling them anyways.
Yeah, it's weird for the PT. On my team, there's been no mention of Spider-Man yet. I think it's release weekend of Spider-Man is the Pro Tour, and these cards are legal and modern. So I just like keep an eye out on these to be like, dude, do these matter? Like, if one of them look really broken, I kind of assume it has to look really broken to even try to test it.
Probably. You could always miss something, but probably. Yeah.